All right, I'm going to give folks just a minute to get to logged on, and then we will start. All righty. All right, hi all. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sloan Salzberg with the Campaign for Transformative Therapies, and welcome to today's webinar about unmet medical needs and how gene therapies can help. So a little bit about who we are to start off. So the Campaign for Transformative Therapies is a campaign of, because we're in DC, the Council for Affordable Health Coverage, which was launched back in 2001, all around this idea of trying to make sure that health coverage is accessible and affordable for all Americans. And we started really working on policies that tried to bring folks together. And so our members are broad. We've got patients, providers, pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers, payers, and then employers as well. So we really work on kind of trying to find those policies that we can develop and then advocate for on the Hill that bring folks together. And around that, in the drug pricing space, we started to kind of take a deep dive into drug pricing. And gene therapy started kind of popping up and trying to figure out innovative ways to pay for those. And we realized this is kind of its own entity. And so we decided, and very serendipitously in February of 2020, launched the Campaign for Transformative Therapies, which is very targeted at trying to figure out and develop, advocate for policies that encourage outcomes-based arrangements or innovative payment arrangements for gene therapies. And we wanted to bring, again, those kind of disparate players to the table to make sure that the policies that we are developing and advocating for actually help kind of everyone around at the table. So today we are doing a webinar. We're hosting a webinar with, we've got a great panel all around kind of unmet medical needs and how gene therapies are being developed, how they're working, and then what we need to do kind of at the end of the day to make sure that patients who have unmet medical needs can actually access those gene therapies. So we've got a great panel of speakers. We've got Annie Kennedy from the Every Life Foundation, Will Hubbard, who's a hemophilia patient advocate, Glenn O'Neill from the Cure San Filippo Foundation, and then Dr. Stephen Pipe from the University of Michigan. So with that, I am going to throw it over to Annie to take us off.
Thanks so much, Sloan. So hi, I'm Annie Kennedy. I'm the Chief of Policy and Advocacy with the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. And for those who aren't familiar with us, the Every Life Foundation is a policy organization comprised of patient advocacy organizations and other partners, including biopharmaceutical organizations, focused on working towards policy that empowers communities to focus on science-driven legislation and policy focused on access to life-saving diagnosis, treatments, and cures. And many of those innovations really are in the gene therapy space today. Next slide. So just a little context for the study that we're going to talk about today. In many of our rare disease communities, we are seeing innovations and pipelines moving forward that are changing the lives of rare disease communities. And what we've seen through many of the statutory changes, thanks to PDUFA 5, PDUFA 6, 21st Century Cures, is that there's been an inclusion of patient experience data and consideration of the experiences and the lived experience of the patient community in the design of clinical trials and in regulatory review and decision making. That has been critical to how we think about products. What we need, so next slide. What's critically important is that we continue this evolution of the inclusion of patient experience data into the access environment so that we ensure that the outcomes that matter to patients are not just included in how we design clinical trials and how we measure benefit within a clinical trial or within regulatory review, but that we're also doing that in the access environment as well. So one of the things that was happening often in rare diseases is that as we were beginning to see the first approved therapies, much of this work was being done. So patients were being included in the protocols that were being designed in clinical trials, and then patient experience data is now included within regulatory review at FDA. But then we were finding ourselves in very complex access environments, and we were having conversations with payers and having conversations with HTAs, and questions were being asked around, well, how do we include this patient experience data? How has this data been quantified that we can include it within our decision making? And so that really led us as a foundation to, next slide, launch the economic burden of rare disease study to begin to better understand how we could, first of all, shift this discussion around and amass some real data around the lived experience in rare disease, to begin to pull the veil back, if you will, on what the real economic impact of rare disease is in the US and what the public health impact of rare disease is, and to begin to shift the dialogue from just the direct costs in rare disease, but also to collect some real data around the indirect and non-medical costs in rare disease, which are often those costs that are absorbed by families and are not those costs that are being discussed in real policy decisions. And so what we did is we conducted the largest, most comprehensive assessment of rare disease to date. As I mentioned, it did include medical, indirect, and non-medical costs. I'll talk more about. It was led by the rare disease community for the community. The data elements that were collected were determined by the community. And again, the goal was to fill this knowledge gap and to better understand which data elements we would need to be collecting across the broad rare disease community and how to collect them. So for the sake of time, next slide. So just a little taxonomy, or to define what those costs were. So the direct medical costs are those costs that we typically see in actuarials. So the costs that show up in your explanations of benefits, that are the inpatient and outpatient care costs, your physician's visits, your prescription medications, hospitalizations, durable medical equipment costs, so the costs for wheelchairs, leg braces, anything that's reimbursed by insurance for dental care, perhaps. And this, we include costs from Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial insurance. We use the United Healthcare database for this. Now, indirect costs are often referred to as productivity losses. So this is forced retirement. Sometimes in terms of health economics, it's referred to as early retirement, but in terms of rare disease, this isn't somebody saving up and retiring early into their dream home. This is being forced out of the workplace and retiring early because you or loved one has been diagnosed with a rare disease. Absenteeism, so the inability to go to work because you yourself are diagnosed or you're a caregiver, and presenteeism. So this is when you are at work, but you're not performing to your full capacity, or you're having to spend a lot of time scheduling appointments, returning calls. Again, you're not fully functional when you're in the workplace. And then reduction in community participation and volunteer service. So again, these were things that we measured in this study. And then non-medical and uncovered health costs. So very importantly, these are costs that are absorbed. These are costs that are not covered by insurance, but are absorbed out of pocket by families. So transportation costs, homeschooling costs, school accommodations, out-of-pocket costs for paid caregiving, and health costs that aren't reimbursed by insurance. So medical treatments, holistic care, medical nutrition, dental care very often, and many other things that are prescribed by physicians but are not covered by insurance, that have to be covered out of pocket by families. So next. And so I'm going to highlight a couple things about the design of the study, and then we'll get into the data. So in the rare disease community, we estimate that there are anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 rare diseases. One of the limitations in how we measure data in this is that there are not what are called international classification codes, or codes that help us track data in all of these diseases. So it's hard to actually go into data sets and find data on all of these diseases. So we tracked data related to 379 rare diseases. So I think it's important to say when we show you this data, we are just showing data at the tip of the iceberg. We're just looking at what we can see above the surface based on the data that we can track, but there is a lot more information below the surface. So this is just the beginning. So we looked at 379 rare diseases with an estimated prevalence in the 379 rare diseases of 15.5 million Americans. We estimate around 30 million Americans, but again, we suspect that that's an underestimate. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what we found is that in this study, of those that we were sampling and looking at, again, the 379 rare diseases, the estimated prevalence of 15.5 million in 1 year, in 2019, the economic impact was $966 billion. So I'm just going to pause on that for a second. It was nearly $1 trillion was the public health impact of rare diseases. More importantly, I want to break that down a little bit more if we can go to the next slide. What is staggering about this number, but not surprising, is that the indirect and non-medical costs were greater than the direct medical costs, meaning that the costs that we spend more time talking about in policy discussions, those direct medical costs, the ones that are showing up in the actuarials and the ones that we spend a lot of time debating, importantly, are not the cost drivers in rare diseases. The cost drivers are the costs being absorbed directly by families. So those indirect and non-medical costs, the ones that are out of pocket for the families living with rare diseases, are the most significant costs when you look at this full equation. Next slide. We also, as a part of the study, the way we collected this indirect and non-medical costs is we disseminated a survey to the rare disease community. And so we spent a lot of time trying to tease out exactly where those costs are in order to determine the indirect and non-medical costs. And that data is extremely important because it helps us understand what types of data elements are really important to the rare disease community and can really help us when we look at outcomes-based arrangements. How do we further mitigate or reduce the impact of a rare disease for our families? But it also helps us create a narrative and understand where can we streamline or reduce costs within our direct medical costs, which I'll give an example of. So this is where we saw the cost drivers in the direct medical costs. And we saw that the #1 cost driver were inpatient costs, followed by outpatient, and then you can see on down the line. So the driver wasn't prescription medications. The drivers were those inpatient and outpatient costs. Can we get to the next slide? Indirect costs, similarly, again, I went through some of these categories before. We can see where the cost drivers were. And then if we go to the non-medical costs, I want to be respectful of my other panelists, we can see health services not covered by insurance. So again, those are services that are prescribed by a clinician to a patient to treat their rare disease that are not covered by insurance. So you're given a prescription for an intervention, and then you have to pay it out of pocket because it is not covered by your insurance. That was the #1 cost driver in the non-medical costs, and then on down the line. So these are not considered optional services. These are services in order to enable living with your rare disease, and these are significant cost drivers. The next slide. And I think I've made this point, but this is a really important quote that we received from a father who has a son with a rare disease. If a family cannot afford to repair an electric wheelchair, buy a hearing aid, fix their teeth, or travel to specialists, then the person with the rare disease receives inadequate care. These costs accumulate and limit educational and career opportunities, making it harder to contribute to society. All of these costs listed here are considered non-medical costs and are not reimbursed by insurance. Okay, next. So this is, as I said, in the data that we collected from the survey, we're looking to help create a narrative and understand where some of the direct cost drivers were. And this is a great example. We wanted to better understand the diagnostic odyssey in rare disease. So how long does it take from the time that somebody is first experiencing their symptoms of their rare disease until there's a confirmed diagnosis? What are maybe some of those cost drivers that we're seeing in those inpatient and outpatient visits, and where can we streamline some of those? And what we saw is that the average was 6.3 years in that diagnostic odyssey. So from time to first concern to confirmed diagnosis, with an average of 17 specialists. So those are significant costs being incurred in the direct cost setting that we could be streamlining through programs like better diagnostics, newborn screening tools that we have now. Okay, next slide. And I think we can just end on this to show that for the point of this panel and the discussion today, I think what we've learned and we've shown is that there are ways to quantitate the priorities of the rare disease community. It's incredibly important that patient communities be a part of the proposals and the policies and the plans that we're bringing forward as we look at these outcomes-based proposals and assessments, and understand what are the priorities to the community so we can be measuring them, quantifying them, and building them into the proposals that we're bringing forward. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Annie. All right, I'm just gonna fast forward. All right, Will, we're gonna throw it over to you to talk a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, thank you, Sloan. So my name is Will Hubbard. Just a little bit of background about me. I've been involved in the hemophilia community since I was a little kid, teaching even littler kids how to give themselves self-infusions. And since then, I've sort of bounced around from role to role and job to job. Most recently, I was the policy and advocacy intern for the Hemophilia Federation of America. So hemophilia is a bleeding disorder. It affects about 20,000 people in the US. It's caused when a person is missing a clotting factor, which is a protein in the blood that enables your blood to form clots. And without these clotting factors, any sorts of cuts, abrasions, internal bleeding can go without forming any sort of clots and just sort of linger. The most common complications that we see with hemophilia are internal bleeding, even though the stereotype is, oh, you get a paper cut and you bleed to death. These sorts of external bleeds are less common. What's more common is internal bleeding to joints. And if left unaddressed, these can create serious complications quite quickly. Also bleeds to the head. Sorry, this doesn't need to be the whole medical overview. I'll move through this quickly. But the long-term damage that we can see even with treatment is long-term damage to the synovial membrane of a joint, which can have implications for chronic pain, joint mobility, and a whole range of downstream health outcomes. So what are the medications we have to prevent that are actually pretty decent right now. They are very, very expensive. So for a while, the gold standard was factor replacement, where you're using either a human-derived or a recombinant synthetic clotting factor that replaces the clotting factor that the person with hemophilia is missing. Now there are some longer-acting alternatives, whether those are pegylated, monoclonal antibodies. There are a couple different technologies in this space that we're seeing that aren't actually a straight one-to-one replacement for the factor molecule, but fulfill a similar function. These medications, however, are extremely expensive, and attaining access to them can be quite difficult. In addition to just finding good insurance, getting access to doctors in your network who are familiar with the disease state and all the associated health needs. There are also things like step therapy, accumulator adjusters, sort of standing between patients and access to these therapies. And I want to make a couple brief points about hemophilia and gene therapy, and then I'll turn it over to my amazing panelists. The first I want to make is that hemophilia, we think of it as sort of a monolithic disease state, but it's actually sort of an umbrella category. And within hemophilia, you're talking about a lot of different permutations and variations. Which clotting factor are you missing? If you're missing a clotting factor at a certain level, what is that level, right? Do you have 1% of what a normal person might have? Do you have 0.01%? Even within that, what's your factor potency? Because two people who have the same factor levels might bleed at completely different rates, which isn't fully explained by just the levels. And so that's an additional thing. And then even within that, we have additional gradations such as inhibitors, which are a complication in which the body's immune system does not recognize the factor replacement and attacks it, which makes treatment much more difficult. So within this umbrella category of hemophilia, you're dealing with a huge diversity of different patient experiences, both medically and sort of logistically in our experience of the American healthcare system, right? Are you living in a state with Medicaid expansion? You know, are you able to get the therapy that your doctor wants to prescribe to you, or are you going to have to fail off a different product first? And I bring all of this up to make the point that these things shape how patients think about gene therapy, right? People with hemophilia are lucky enough to exist in a space where there are some therapies out there that work pretty well for some people. The operative terms there being pretty well in some people, right? So if you ask, what's your attitude on gene therapy? That depends. Are you talking to someone with an inhibitor who can't use factor and is dealing with tons of bleeds that are disrupting their education, their job attainment, their personal relationships in every aspect of their life? Or are you talking to someone with mild hemophilia A who's well served by the current therapies, right? These things matter because patients will have different attitudes. A second question is, what will that gene therapy actually mean to my lived experience? And here again, where the patient has been, their sort of logistical experience of the healthcare system and their specific diagnosis will shape that, right? Are they looking down the barrel of lots of long-term joint damage, or are they feeling pretty secure and happy with their current treatment regimen? And beyond that, how optimistic are the researchers about the specific gene therapies coming down the pipeline for them, right? Because this, for instance, hemophilia B, factor 9, the research is moving faster than hemophilia A, is my understanding in the gene therapy space. And so things like that also make a difference. And then finally, what will it be like when I have this gene therapy 5 years, 8 years, 10 years down the road? What will my factor levels be like? Will I need to keep some sort of recombinant clotting factor around the house in case I do have a breakthrough bleeding episode, or will that not be necessary? Will I be able to participate in running, rock climbing, whatever it may be, right? Or is it simply, can I go back to my job? Can I complete my degree? Patients will have different needs and different concerns and different questions, which really speaks to the need for, open discourse between providers and patients, right? That acknowledges these complexities, and a legislative framework and a payout system that embraces these nuances and creates space where patients can have these nuanced conversations about outcomes. So that's me and that's my shtick, and I don't want to take more time than that. I want to turn it over to my amazing panelists. If you have any questions, let me know, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Will. That was great. All right, Glenn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today to share my story. I'm Glenn O'Neill, father to my son Beckham, who's 14 and healthy, and my daughter Eliza, who's age 11, and husband to my wife Kara. We were living what we thought was the typical life back in 2013. When my daughter, age 3, began having some challenges in her daycare. There were some concerns about some mild developmental delay and some of her socialization, but otherwise she was a happy, playful, talkative, loving little girl, little 3-year-old. The doctors had run a slew of tests on her, and one of them, she was being referred to genetics. It was there that we were told of Eliza's diagnosis of Sanfilippo syndrome, something I had never heard of, and I'm not sure how many listening today have heard of it either. We were in shock at the diagnosis, me not understanding what I was hearing really. And my wife, who was a pediatrician, faintly remembered the name from a board exam question that she had. And she knew it was in this group of MPS disorders and that it was a terrible diagnosis is what she remembered. So Sanfilippo kind of a high level, what is it? It's a genetic disease, a lysosomal storage disease. And my wife and I were unknowingly carriers of this defective gene. My son was healthy, so we didn't know this was coming down the road, and we actually felt lucky in hindsight now that he dodged this terrible diagnosis. But for my beautiful daughter, here we were finding out that Sanfilippo syndrome is a terminal, rapidly degenerative disease. So everything that she could do at the time would be lost in the coming years. Children lose the ability to talk, to eat. They lose all mobility. They suffer seizures, suffer severe dementia, and it's really brain destruction is what's happening, and then death, which is usually in their teens. The progression is often likened to being like a late stage Alzheimer's, only in little children. So here we were in the genetics office, finding out that my daughter's best days were likely behind her, and she was just 3.5. So saying we were crushed and devastated doesn't really even do it justice, what we were feeling then and what we feel now. But of course, I thought there must be some kind of medicine. There has to be something doctors could do. There has to be something. But there wasn't, and there still isn't today. There's no FDA-approved treatments. At the time, there were no clinical trials that she could be part of, and we saw what seemed like very little activity in the space of Sanfilippo addressing this disease. We knew that we needed to do something and be part of accelerating the research towards bringing forward more clinical trials. And with that, we created Cure Sanfilippo Foundation. 8 years later now, we have over 100 engaged families, and the foundation has raised over $16 million for research, funded 30 plus research grants, and helped fund 3 clinical trials, 2 of which are in gene therapy. But when we're talking about clinical trials in Sanfilippo, we're talking about a very few, a handful or less, with stringent criteria, and those typically only enroll between 5 to 20 children each and take years. For example, a gene therapy trial, which started in 2016, has now treated about 20 children as of today, and you know, that's 20 children over 5 years. So it's kind of a very long process against a disease that's very rapid. And the reality is that the majority of children, the thousands around the United States and the many, many thousands around the world will have, excuse me, no opportunity to receive any type of experimental treatment, and they'll suffer and they'll die. Our community has watched 3 biotechs abandon the Sanfilippo space. There were mismatches between the endpoints chosen and the patients enrolled, the length of the trial that it was taking to achieve such endpoints, and also apparently business reasons. Were these viable treatments that were put on the shelf because it didn't seem like it would be favorably received by regulators? Why were these companies not putting in the effort, the time, and the money commitments that we're seeing in other diseases to see them fully through? We fear that without change, we will see more of this. We need to see more activity, more incentives, and more paths to treatments in the Sanfilippo space. It's important for industry regulators and payers to look at all possible meaningful benefits, not as defined by them, but as defined by the patients and the caregivers, those who know firsthand what is meaningful. And that's when considering trial design, approvals, and reimbursement. And it would be a cost savings to invest in treatments for Sanfilippo, as Annie pointed out in the burden study. Also, special considerations, I believe, should be made in degenerative diseases like Sanfilippo. That benefit can look different among patients at different points in their disease process, but that benefit is no less meaningful to that child and to that family. It's tragic to have personally seen so many children lose all their abilities and die over the past 8 years without even getting a chance at a promising experimental and safe treatment that do exist today. We wonder, why is it easier to approve a drug for eczema or depression than it is for Sanfilippo? How can our country put humanity at the forefront for these rare children? It should not be harder to approve something that gives kids a better and longer life than it is to stop an itch or to improve depression. Again, in Sanfilippo, severe and rapid dementia and death always. That's our risk. and it's important that everyone making decisions about how treatments move forward take into account the really ultimate and the certain risk and the cost of taking no action. Thank you for your time, and look forward to any questions.
Thanks so much, Glenn. All right. Share the screen. Oh, there's Glenn's family. All right. All right, Dr. Pipe.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephen Pipe from the University of Michigan. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about some of the exciting developments in hemophilia and where remaining challenges are. Will's already introduced the main pathologies that we see in patients with hemophilia. Our treatment goals are straightforward in that we need therapies that can effectively treat bleeds, can avoid bleeds. We think if we do that, we can avoid joint disease, and we can avoid the complications of bleeding. And really the overarching goal is to help patients achieve the life they choose. We do have therapies that can lead us along the way to these goals, but they currently require a tremendous burden on the individual, on the family, as well as the healthcare system. And they are still missing the mark with regards to achieving all of these outcomes. Next slide. So gene therapy, the goal here is to replace the dysfunctional gene with an exogenous functional gene to cure the disease. This can be applied to a lot of monogenic diseases, but it's particularly applicable to hemophilia. To do this, we take the DNA, which is the payload, if you like, and then this has to be packaged in some sort of a delivery vehicle. And with decades of research in this area, we've settled on this particular innocuous viral vector called adeno-associated virus. We encounter these viruses every day. They are non-pathogenic. They don't cause any sort of disease. And we can strip out the viral elements that allow these viruses to propagate, and we can substitute it with the transgene, we call it, which is the payload, and we just use the packaging as the delivery. And so what happens is a single treatment event, these vectors containing either the factor VIII or the factor IX gene are administered through an IV infusion. This is an outpatient procedure, occurs within about a 1 to 3 hour infusion. These viruses have a homing ability, and they get targeted to the hepatocyte, which is the liver cell. Gets taken up by the cell, and then it delivers the payload, the gene, to the nucleus of the cell, and there it remains inside the cell, and it allows the natural machinery of the hepatocyte to start manufacturing factor VIII and factor IX, which then goes through the normal secretion pathways into the blood and corrects the bleeding phenotype for the patient because they're able to achieve adequate levels of factor VIII or factor IX. Next slide. So to give you the conclusions of a long track record of clinical trials all the way up through phase 3 currently, it looks like this is really going to become a powerful approach in our management of hemophilia, and for many patients can offer a definitive cure. The clinical trials are demonstrating that a single intravenous infusion of vectors containing factor VIII or factor IX DNA can achieve high protein expression levels, long-term durable factor expression, the absence of spontaneous or traumatic bleeds in patients who've been effectively transduced. And these patients have been able to stop all of their prophylaxis regimens. So instead of having to rely on these repeated IV infusions of factor VIII and factor IX, this single treatment event has liberated them from that burden. It's not without some complications which have to be managed. Liver transaminases are a marker of liver toxicity. These have been asymptomatic in these trials. They can be managed with a course of corticosteroids, which is an immunomodulatory agent. And the thought is that this represents some sort of an immune reaction to the AAV vector. In some cases, this can lead to loss or even complete loss of the transgene expression, so the gene therapy won't be effective. So this does require active management in the post-infusion phase to achieve the best outcomes for patients. Next slide. So we've been preparing to ramp up for a potentially approved product sometime next year, maybe at the earliest. And this is the pathway that we've been looking at for delivery of gene therapy through the Hemophilia Treatment Center network. We're actively educating our patients and our multidisciplinary teams. The final safety and efficacy data will come from the phase 3 trials, and there's both phase 3 trials for hemophilia A and B, which will be wrapping up over the next 12 months or so. There's certainly hope for regulatory approval, but then we're also going to need a viable pathway for access to these therapies. It's going to involve prior authorizations. What does drug acquisition look like, and how is it going to be reimbursed? The sites actively need to be preparing. I've been involved in clinical trials at Michigan now for 5 years, but this was a long ramp up to get us prepared to deliver this kind of therapy and do the appropriate follow-up. So we've identified a number of hurdles that individual hemophilia treatment centers are going to have to overcome to be able to be prepared to deliver gene therapy and continue to strive for excellence in outcomes in patients. Next slide. So some of the site preparedness issues we're dealing with is the product handling and administration. This has to go through infection control committees. We have to get approvals about nursing handling in the infusion centers, and then patient and staff precautions. There's pharmacy preparedness that's needed. I've been working for many years now with my research pharmacy team, but when we switch to a commercial product, we're now going to be dealing with our with our clinical pharmacies in the hospitals, and they don't have experience with these therapeutics. And so we have to train them on receipt, handling, storage, how do they contain when they're thawing and mixing up the vector. And we have to make decisions at individual centers about where we're going to administer this, how the patient's going to be observed after administration. And then a lot of work to be done on who is the ideal candidate for these therapies, how are they going to be followed. I mentioned the liver toxicity that needs to be managed post-infusion. And as with most things, as we get more familiar and we practice caring for these patients, this is ultimately going to lead to improved outcomes. Next slide. So we've identified 4 universal principles for the introduction of gene therapy to people with hemophilia. We think persons with hemophilia should be at the center of decision making. All persons with hemophilia should have equal opportunity to access gene therapy. It shouldn't matter where they live in the country, what insurance plans they have. The safe introduction is going to require lifetime follow-up in order to ensure long-term success. And we believe the integrated comprehensive care model that's currently employed within the hemophilia treatment centers is the best way to introduce and deliver this therapy and do the long-term follow-up that's needed. Next slide. The Regional Hemophilia Network is supported by HRSA through the Maternal and Child Health Bureau branch. We have 8 regional networks divided over the country, and there's 140 hemophilia treatment centers across the country. And we do data collection for national objectives. Next slide. These are the 8 networks. I work within this Great Lakes region, which includes Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. Next slide. Now, if we look at the gene therapy clinical experience in the USA today, it's actually been nicely distributed according to the geography and according to the regions. So we have sites that have gene therapy experience in essentially every one of the hemophilia regions for the network. We know that there's at least 36 sites who have gene therapy experience, but we also know that even within the clinical trial framework, 9 of those 36 sites never got to the point of actually dosing a patient in a phase 3 trial. And many of those sites identified institutional infrastructure barriers in getting them to that place. Next slide. We see 3 key roles in delivering and following up patients with hemophilia. Obviously, a dosing center has to be responsible for preparing and administering the gene therapy. A follow-up center could follow that patient subsequently. So this dosing center could act like a hub, and so we have what we call a hub and a spoke model. But there's also potentially a role for a supervisory center. These would be the more experienced centers who would be responsible for all the aspects of care, making sure that patients are appropriately consented, dosed, and had proper follow-up and data reporting. And how each individual HTC hemophilia treatment center chooses to take on these roles remains to be seen. Next slide. In delivering access to gene therapy, drug access and reimbursement is a big open question. We think it's likely to require innovative payment approaches. And it's possible that maybe for the first time, these payments are going to be linked to specific outcome measures. For example, whether the factor activity persists after gene therapy, that the patient is able to demonstrate continued bleed control and can continue to maintain cessation from their prophylactic regimen. And in some cases, are they able to reduce or completely eliminate their need for any factor replacement? Next slide. So these are the last two slides. I just want to focus on some of the unresolved challenges. The reimbursement and funds flow models have yet to be established. And particularly, what does this look like with a hub and spoke delivery structure and a private pay model? You know, as you're familiar, even with expensive therapies, usually there's a single point of acquisition and reimbursement for that therapy. But when I've pointed out here a structure of a supervisory center, a dosing center, a follow-up center, all who have key roles, what does the payment look like? What does the reimbursement look like? How do we make sure that all of those roles are being compensated adequately? Coordination of care between the hemophilia treatment centers is going to be key. But we really have limited experience with patients moving fluidly for services between HTCs. Many of my patients have been at our center since birth and have been followed all the way into adulthood. They're not used to going to other places to receive individual care. We mentioned the institutional approvals and local infrastructure needs. This is going to happen at a site level. There's going to be personnel and staffing issues, and this is part of the reimbursement and payment flows model. If we have to take on new roles within our multidisciplinary team, where is the funding going to come from to support that? And then, of course, we're all going to have to develop new standards of practice and then share those best practices across the network. Next slide. So in conclusion, the U.S. hemophilia treatment centers already have a collaborative and integrated national infrastructure divided across 8 regional hemophilia networks. About 25% of all the HTCs already have clinical trial experience from phase 1 through 3, but we still have institutional infrastructure barriers that are posing a challenge to getting sites up and ready for dosing. The hub and spoke model has already been operational within the clinical trial programs. At our center at Michigan, we've dosed patients from all over the country where they've come to our center, we've done the dosing, and then they've gone back to their host center for their follow-up. So that model has worked. The question is, can we get it to work within the frameworks of drug acquisition and reimbursement and funds flow models? So this last point may really be the most critical hurdle. We're going to look internally at taking care of the HTC preparedness and focusing on educational priorities. But we really want to make sure that pharma bears significant responsibility to ensure that the HTCs will be compensated adequately for their contribution to gene therapy delivery, whether they're serving as a referral center, a dosing and coordinating center, or as one of these follow-up centers. So thank you again for the opportunity to present today.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pipe. I know I have a bunch of questions for folks, but I'm going to Dr. Pipe sent me up for a nice little volley into these innovative payment arrangements that he referenced, or also known sometimes as outcomes-based arrangements. And I just want to take a second to kind of restate, Glenn and Will kind of talked about there's a real need for innovation, and Annie really hit on the fact that, when you look at the whole healthcare dollar, right, there's a lot of attention being focused right now, especially in Washington and DC and Congress, on drug pricing. But when you look at that whole healthcare dollar, the majority of the funds are still in that hospital kind of, physician care side of the thing. And the drugs or the things or the innovation or the treatments, those are what we're trying to keep people out of the hospitals. And so when we're trying to figure out and look at, innovation in this space, you want to continue to make sure that we have more funds going towards creating more cures. So hopefully one day we have a cure or a treatment for Sanfilippo. We continue to get better cures for the conditions that are already out there. So you really have to weigh kind of the economics of the situation and make sure that you're not going to do something so detrimental to the kind of pharmaceutical space, and that we no longer have those incentives there. And so one of those kind of areas as folks are looking into this are these innovative payment arrangements. How do we incentivize continued innovation in the space? And I know I've said that like 8 times, but how do we continue to incentivize that and still maintain access? And so there's this relatively kind of new idea around these outcomes-based arrangements where you're really measuring, did the drug do what it was supposed to do? And now I have a zoology kind of basic science background. And when you're doing any kind of experiment, right, in order to tell that that one thing did what it was supposed to do, you're supposed to remove all of the other variables. As Dr. Pipe, I think, alluded to, and as we all know, human beings, it's almost impossible to remove every single variable other than the drug and to see what the drug did. And so it's really difficult. And so as these, new treatments are kind of coming on board, especially gene therapies, we're really trying to figure out, how do we tell that that therapy did what it did, and can we base payment on that? And so very helpfully, VBAs have a bunch of different names. And so sometimes they're called outcomes-based arrangements or agreements. I've also heard results-based or indication-based, pay for performance. Innovative payment arrangements is kind of like a catch-all term, but I'm going to use value-based payment arrangements because that's the one kind of Congress and CMS have been using recently. And so basically they tie reimbursement to their outcomes. So did the drug do what it was supposed to do? And if it did, then we're going to reimburse based on that. And the way that you can measure it is varied. So Dr. Pipe was talking about in hemophilia, you might be able to use measure how much factor is being produced. Cancer, sometimes they're actually measuring, did the tumor reduce in size? Other times you can use other kind of clinical circumstances. I've heard of some drugs that are used to help basically stop heart attacks. Did the patient have another heart attack? Sometimes folks are using adherence measures. Are the patients continuing to pick up the medication? They're going to assume that that medication is working. And so you tie the reimbursement structure, and it can vary. So you can have a rebate or a refund after the fact. You can pay directly for the service if something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. And so when we're defining these things in statute, when we're trying to figure out how to make sure that value-based payment arrangements can actually move forward and folks can kind of innovate and play with them in real life, we want to make sure that those definitions aren't so static. So that's a really important point. The other kind of political or policy barriers to these are kind of the 2 different buckets. So one is the federal health program drug pricing regulations. And so this gets down into the economics of how federal programs reimburse for drugs. And so that's Medicaid best price, and that's average manufacturer price. There's a couple of others, but those are the 2 kind of main ones. Medicaid best price essentially says that Medicaid programs, the entire Medicaid program across all 50 states, gets the best price. So the lowest price that drug is offered on the commercial market. In value-based payment arrangements, let's say you had an arrangement that said for a gene therapy that said, this thing works, you're going to pay X dollars. And if it doesn't work, it didn't do what it was supposed to do, we're going to give you 100% refund or a 90% refund or whatever it is. That would lower that best price down to 10% or $0 or whatever that is. That would mean that triggers that best price provision, which means that they would then have to provide that drug at the $0 for the entire Medicaid program, regardless on whether or not it works. And so making sure that we actually protect these from triggering that, while still making sure that states have a fair access to the lowest cost drug, is really important. And the same kind of argument is made for average manufacturer price. And the other kind of side of the policy barriers is this fraud and abuse laws, and anti-kickback statute in Stark. I'm always first to say I'm not a lawyer, although I've looked at these statutes a lot recently. And anti-kickback in Stark, essentially, basically, they don't allow providers to provide anything for free for anti-kickbacks, called remuneration. And so again, it's kind of that same theory. Under some pay for results situations, those discounts could be considered a kickback. And so again, you want to protect these from the anti-kickback and Stark laws to make sure that we can go through and that nobody's going to get in trouble, but still make sure that you're basing payment on some kind of outcome, the patient's seeing some kind of value, and then they're able to get reimbursed for that. So there are a couple things going on in DC. So you've got the regulation side and the legislative side. On the regulation side, at the end of last year, CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, released a final rule related to Medicaid value-based payment arrangements. And it essentially allowed manufacturers to report multiple best prices, which if they have a value-based payment arrangement, and it was for any drug, not just gene therapies, any drug. If they had a value-based payment arrangement, they are supposed to report what that price is if the patient responded, and then you have quote unquote the non-responders, so those patients that didn't hit those outcomes, what the price was. And that was a way to kind of get around this best price provision. Now there was an updated, the Biden administration, when they started this year, they kind of did a total regulatory freeze, and then they just came out a couple weeks ago with an update where they basically just postponed the reporting deadline because CMS needs to build/update its current structure where there are so folks can report those multiple best prices. So it's kind of fixed, but as folks, if you've been following regulations with recent change in administrations, they can be rescinded, they can be put back. And so it's a little volatile. And really what you want to do is move to the legislation, put something in law. It's really hard to change law, and make sure that we can continue kind of get innovation, incentives in this space to really kind of develop and mature these value-based payment arrangements. And hopefully one day they won't just be for, super high priced drugs. We could get it for, other kind of drugs that have interesting applications. And so legislation, we've got kind of two different activities going on in the House and the Senate. So the House, we've got a great bill being developed right now by Representative Schrader, Guthrie, and Mullen. And they're looking at, it's still in draft form, so we are actively working on that. I invite folks to work with us on making sure that that language is where we want it to be. And they're looking at potentially codifying what the CMS did in their final rule. And so making sure that that's actually in statute. Then there's another effort going on that has actually been introduced. So we have current bill language in the Senate, and it's the Crapo-Burr Lower Cost More Cures Act, and it's S2164. And Section 121 kind of starts on that, and it really, we're really, CTT is very excited about that language because they went through specifically for value-based payment arrangements and included clear exemptions from best price and AMP. They allowed states to access those multiple best prices. They had quarterly reporting to make sure that manufacturers are actually reporting what's going on. That's been a kind of a constant feedback that we're getting from folks in government. They don't really know what these are and what the specifics and how they work. And so having some kind of reporting mechanism as we're testing these, in the private and public sector, that we have adequate kind of transparency into what these things are and how patients are accessing those drugs. And then the Senate language also includes the anti-kickback statute and Stark safe harbors. As well as a GAO study to really look into what these patients are, how they're being affected. Do they know that their drug is on a value-based payment arrangement? Are these, the kind of the ultimate goal, right, of any drug is that you're improving outcomes. And so are these actually improving outcomes? And then what does it look like from the patient side of you, kind of going back to what Annie was talking about, what do their out-of-pocket costs look like? are value-based payment arrangements reducing that barrier? Are patients actually able to access the drugs? And are they happy? Are they part of that conversation? Are these outcomes-based arrangements actually measuring what patients see as valuable, or are they not measuring that? So I'm going to end it there and open it up for questions. And this is the Zoom webinar. So if you have any questions, you can type it into the little chat button or the Q&A button. And if folks don't have questions, I will take my prerogative as a moderator and start off and ask a couple to begin with. So I'm gonna give folks. Okay, so Annie, I'm gonna ask you. You talked about kind of the cost drivers, the indirect and direct cost savers. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of, you're looking at that total healthcare dollar and you're looking at cures versus healthcare costs. What are patients experiencing there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to talk about, you gave some examples, Sloan, of what we're measuring. So we're measuring a heart attack and we want to measure another heart attack or prevent another heart attack. We're measuring, I think it's really important to talk about why it's important to involve patients when we talk about what we're measuring, because I would suspect if you pulled patients into that conversation, patients want to measure something before they have another heart attack. Mm-hmm. And there might be some intermediate measures and some metrics that we could be looking at. And I think that was really important in what Glenn and Will and Dr. Pipe were talking about, that involving patient communities and developing those data points and those outcomes, because mortality, pulmonary fall off, cardiac outcomes, severe cardiac outcomes, are not acceptable outcomes to patient communities. There are outcomes that can be measured before we get to that point that should be considered. And from both the perspective of what we measured in the burden study, those are really significant impact costs and impacts in the healthcare system that can be reduced, but more importantly, can be improved for patient communities if we measure them in a more nuanced way. And so one of the things we've been doing in the regulatory environment is creating regulatory incentives where we can have approvals based on surrogate measures. And I don't want to take this conversation in another way that then correlate to other clinical benefit, but also consider what are these other clinical benefits that we can look at. So I think maybe the answer to your question is we need to unpack this a little bit further. We need to look a little bit deeper and better understand each disease community, the heterogeneity within those communities, the subpopulations within those communities. Glenn talked about that within those communities, there are interim steps in disease progression, and how can we slow the disease progression, reverse the disease progression, and not just stratify our trials that way, but stratify even our access policies that way and measure the outcomes within those policies that way. So I think one of the things we did in our studies, we spent a lot of time trying to understand how we collect that data from the rare disease community, and we did it with the community, understand what data elements we could be collecting. But in the very same way, we would love to see payers and those within the access environment doing that with individual disease communities as these policies are being developed and as we're talking about the value-based policy arrangements. Talking to the disease communities and the experts in the communities to understand what should be collected, what should be measured, not a heart attack. What are the interim measures that would be measured to show that there is benefit from this therapeutic intervention?
And this was the approach we took with hemophilia as well. I mean, if you wanted to call it a surrogate or intermediate measure, the factor level really is predictive of the impact on disease, the bleeding, and then ultimately to joint disease progression. So we're using that in the clinical trials. We're going to have those hard outcomes. We can't wait 10, 20 years of data collection to show impacts on joint disease, right? So we have to have these interim measures. But we also went to the patient community. We said, even beyond the factor levels, beyond the bleed rates, What are some of the intangibles that aren't typically captured in clinical trials? So we're trying to get at the impacts on mental health, impacts on work, school attendance, all those other aspects that you highlighted at the beginning are so critically important to families.
And Dr. Pipe, I know you have to run, but I have one quick, hopefully, question, although it's a loaded question. Can you talk a little bit more about the barriers to coordinated care when you're talking about kind of this next stage of if patients can access the gene therapy, what it's going to mean for these patients that maybe haven't been with you for a while and have different physicians?
Yeah, it can be varied. I mean, it could just be personal preference. Families have had a tie to a particular physician and a multidisciplinary team, and they don't feel uncomfortable getting, advanced therapeutics from somebody they don't know. But on the other hand, oftentimes it's also driven by payer systems, and patients are locked in to certain locales to receive care. So yeah, we can fly a patient from Florida up to get dosed at Michigan for gene therapy in the context of a clinical trial. But will a payer allow that to happen in the context of a commercial therapy? And we just don't want those barriers to be there. So yeah, I'll have to go to clinic here, but thanks for allowing me to participate today, and thanks for all who could attend.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pipe. And actually that kind of sets me up. Annie, I had one other question. You were talking about the articles not paid for by insurance, and this is something that I've heard before, where some kind of insurance have, someone keeps falling in their home and breaks their hip and they can't go in and pay for a ramp. And so do you know what are these policies? Is there a policy barrier here, or is there something else that needs to go on so that we can get kind of these almost value-based payment arrangements for insurance? It's also called, I think, sometimes value-based insurance design is another kind of newer policy area that folks are looking into.
I mean, I think if people really understood what we had to measure, what we surveyed on to understand the indirect and non-medical costs, it would be mind-blowing to folks to understand what out-of-pocket costs really are for families, what those costs are. I mean, ramps and vehicle modifications are one example, but even what you would think is a medical cost, what are prescribed by physicians and actually end up being out-of-pocket costs for families. I think that would be mind-blowing to people. I think it's important for people to understand that. I also think, in just the example that Dr. Pipe gave, for that therapy to be delivered for somebody, there's a barrier to fly from one state to another to receive the therapy. But to do that also implies a lot of costs that would be unreimbursed. You have to travel. That is an out-of-pocket cost. Oftentimes it requires a caregiver to go with you. That is an unreimbursed cost. If you have children or dependents who are staying home, those are unreimbursed costs. So as we talk about gene therapy, which is incredibly important to talk about, we're creating a wider gap in the haves and the have-nots who can receive these therapies based on who can even get to the therapeutic interventions, who can afford the time off work, or the caregivers can leave work to receive these interventions. So I think we need to be thinking about this. We need to think about the growing health disparities based on where these therapies are available, where the barriers are to accessing these therapies are, and the lack of reimbursement for all the care delivery around that. It's not just as simple as removing the portability barriers and the state line barriers. It's also, how is someone going to get there? Does it require an overnight stay in a hotel? What does that look like? Who goes with them? And these are things that certainly Glenn and Will know much better than I can and can speak to personally. But these are, families declare bankruptcy very frequently, and this is not something that should be considered acceptable. We should be banging down the doors to change these policies so that anybody, your ability to care for your loved one and to afford access to a therapy that is about to be approved should not be based on your finances.
Yeah. Here. Glenn, we have a question from the audience. Can you speak to the endpoints in the gene trial that were insufficient?
Yeah, so these weren't specifically gene therapy, but what we found was the trials up to this point have focused primarily on the brain, and of course Sanfilippo does affect the brain significantly, but it also affects every cell in the body and the body as well. And some of these trials were an enzyme replacement, and We believe they were having benefit. The patients believe, the PIs believe, even the biotechs believe there was benefit being seen. But since the only focus was primarily on the brain, you know, they were based on these cognitive evaluations where you go in once a year, or I'm sorry, twice a year, and have a cognitive evaluation to see is it better, or is it flatline, or is it getting worse? And just the design of them wasn't, you know, didn't really take into account the caregivers' preferences and what they consider meaningful. And we did a caregiver preference study, and we found out that it wasn't necessarily just fixing the brain. Of course, that would be wonderful, but we want to start with something. And there are many other things. There's sleep, there's comfort, there's less hyperactivity, your ability to connect with your child, all of these things that are significantly meaningful. And those were not looked at and not accounted for. And we hope we're beginning to make some progress there, but we certainly need the regulatory folks to work with us. We also have biomarkers that we believe could identify reducing the main portion of what's being built up in Sanfilippo, which is heparan sulfate. And we know that can be reduced. And we believe that reducing that should be enough to approve a treatment. And similar to Alzheimer's now, to run a 10-year study to confirm, does that reduction in heparan sulfate indeed relate to a better life for these children and a longer life for these children? And we think the answer is going to be yes. So I hope that answers.
No, that was great. And then, Will, I just wanted to reiterate, and I know we're over time here, so we'll end on this. I thought what you said about the one size doesn't fit all and what will gene therapy mean to me was really, really important. And this gets to kind of this idea of the precision medicine, the right drug for the right patient at the right time. And then adding on to it, the right reimbursement. And so how, again, I just want to really make this clear. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to continue working through CTT and CHC on trying to develop policies that, again, incentivize continued drug innovation in the space that won't harm innovation, that won't harm access, but making sure that we do get adequate reimbursement for these incredible therapies. And that reimbursement is hopefully based on outcomes to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. And then you get reimbursed because of that. Because at the end of the day, I like paying for things when they work, and then when they don't work, I like returning them to the store. And so having that kind of same analogy, I think, in the healthcare space is a path that we want to continue on. And I hope that you all are able to work with us on this as we work with Congress to pass some of these laws. And thank you to our panelists. I know Dr. Pipe's not here anymore, but you guys were fantastic, and I look forward to continuing working with you.
Yeah, thank you, Sloan. This is a lot of pressure getting the last word in, but I'll try to be brief because we have gone over time. The first thing I wanted to say is this question of attaining access to even trials for gene therapy is something that's come up in hemophilia as well, and something the community's been very attentive to. You saw that great map that Dr. Piper pulled up, where you saw the different hemophilia treatment centers and which ones were prepared to do trials, right? And I know patients with severe inhibitors, lots of hemophilic complications, who are traveling across the country to get to the right center to do one of these, finding the hotels, getting time away from work. And this is also important because you want an equitable and diverse group, because the data you put in is the data you get out. So for instance, women with bleeding disorders are an underserved population. If we're not putting them in the trials, then we won't necessarily know how they will be served by those gene therapies. And answering all those questions in the clinical trial stage is really important. So I know that's sort of off topic, but I wanted to get that in because that's something that's been leaders in the hemophilia community have been thinking about a lot. Then the second point, your question about sort of there not being a one size fits all therapy. What I'll say is that for many people, like I said, hemophilia is a relatively manageable condition. We don't have cures, but we have therapies. And so there's perhaps less urgency for gene therapy, right? Some people want to see more long-term outcomes. If it's an AAV therapy, they might be waiting for a second or third generation, knowing that it's unlikely that they'll be able to get multiple bites of that apple, taking a second AAV that's sort of understood to be a one-time use insertion technique. And so there is this diversity of opinion there. But what's important is that we don't let that obscure the fact that these treatments will be transformative, right, for so many people. And we can't let this, the fact that this is a complex problem, get in the way of innovation, right? Even though not all patients will receive the same outcome, even though not all patients want the same things necessarily from their gene therapy, we can't let that stop the innovation in the process of developing these. And so that requires a nuanced sort of adjustable outcome scheme, which I think you spoke to really eloquently and beautifully. So that's my take. I'm very blessed as someone with the hemophilia. I live sort of a semi-charmed life with the condition. I have friends who are not so fortunate. And so we just have different wants and needs from gene therapy. But throughout all of it, all of us will be served by it. And so it's coming up with a system that would work for the entire population as best as we can.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. All right, thanks all, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.